all of the folks that you see on this screen and every shade in between and even darker can be Latino or Latinx. So the question is, why do we pick one over the other? Or why do we think that one is more likely to be Latinx than another? And this is a question that I've been asking myself ever since childhood. And that's because this story is really personal for me. So that's me and my parents. My mother is an amazing woman, born and raised in the Bronx. Shout out to New York City. And if you're New Rican, that's what we call Puerto Ricans who are from the Bronx. You know that, being Puerto Rican and having pride in your culture is a big thing. And so my mother was the Puerto Rican influence in my life. My father is African American. And so that side of the family comes from South Carolina and Florida. So I grew up in a multicultural household. And if you're like me and you're multicultural or, ethnically ambiguous to some people, people will always ask, what are you? What are you? And I always got that question. And people often would act very doubtful when I told them that I was Latina. Because like those pictures that I showed you, they often have an image in their head of what a Latina is. My hair does lots of different things. It can be straight. In the summer, I'm 3 or 4 shades darker. People look at my features. They just don't know what it is, or they think they know what it is. And so I really embarked on this question of understanding, why do some people get perceived as Latino and why not, but specifically Afro-Latinos, those who have a really high percentage of African ancestry or who are racially Black. Why is it that people question their Latinidad? And if this is something that you can relate to, or that it's true, go ahead and hit me up in the comments and share some of your experiences with this, because I know that I'm not the only one who has observed this. So the second question that inspired this story comes from facts. It comes from data, which is very important in reporting as well. So we have our anecdotes, our personal experiences, the heart that kind of inspires a story. And then we also have data which tells a story. So my question for you all is, how many Puerto Ricans identified as white or Black on the census in 2000? So this is like a wild guess. We're like, we're throwing numbers out. If you had to guess, so you think about Puerto Ricans and your image of Puerto Rico, all right, how many people, so what percentage do you think identified as white, and what percentage do you think identified as Black? And it's okay if that number doesn't total 100%, because there were some other categories on the census. So I just want to throw that out there. So it's okay if, you don't have to say 80 and 20%, but if you were just thinking about it, what would your guesses be? So just take a second and think about that. And then you can put it in the chat. And Hannah, you can throw out some numbers as you start to see them come in.
Seeing 75%, 90%, 40 or 45%, 75. Angie says too many.
Okay. Well, the answer was 80%. So approximately 80% of Puerto Ricans on the island, to be very clear, because Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States. So we know that Puerto Ricans are US citizens, which some people don't know, but you all now know that. So Puerto Ricans on the island, specifically, 80% identified as white. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, because the island has such a rich heritage of mixture. We know that there were Africans who were stolen and enslaved and forced to work on the island. We know that there were indigenous people, the Taino people, who were also enslaved and forced to work on the island, and many of them died because of disease and genocide. So when we think about Puerto Rican identity, we often tout all these 3 backgrounds, Spanish, Taino, and African, and we say that we're so proud of all 3. But the majority of folks see themselves as white or want to be seen as white. And so that inspired a question of why. How did this come about? Is this a matter of people being told that they have to put white? Is this, you know, people attempting to assimilate? Is this people trying to distance themselves from Blackness? I mean, there were so many possibilities. Now, that was in 2000, which we know it's been some time. It's 2020. In 2010, you'll be interested to know that that number dropped to 76%. So some sort of shift happened, right? Now it could be due to self-perception, it could be due to population changes on the island. Like, there's so many different theories about why that happened. But my guess is that there was sort of a consciousness shifting, and that people challenged that 80% number. And so I wanted to go to Puerto Rico to find that out. So I saw a convergence of two things. One thing that I actually didn't put on the slide is that last summer, there was something big happening in Puerto Rico. And I'm just curious to know if anybody can put in the chat what happened last summer, because Puerto Rico was in the news like all the time. So does anyone know what was happening, or can you take a stab at like describing what you remember?
Donna says an election. A couple people are saying protesting the governor, overthrowing the governor, impeachment. Others are referencing hurricanes and earthquakes.
Oh yeah, I'm thank you for those diversity, that diversity of answers, because it's actually convergence of a lot of those things. So we know that, you know, Hurricane Maria devastated the island. There were people who were left without resources, who didn't have power, who were left to die, and it shouldn't have been that way. And so that anger and that hurt and that frustration also met with, you know, financial disaster on the island, and the way that the island had been exploited for its resources and left in, you know, all of this debt. And then you have the protests. So there were protests last summer to oust the governor, Ricardo Rosello, and this was sparked by some text messages in which there were sexist, homophobic, and really classist and just crass language used to describe the citizens on the island. Really disrespectful things that were said about the people in the wake of the hurricane. And so people were fed up and they took to the streets and they actually got him out. He said that he wasn't going to step down. And as I was pitching this story, you know, he stepped down. So I thought, okay, if we're looking at a revolution on the island, what does a revolution when it comes to race look like? Right? So we're talking about sexism, we're talking about homophobia, we're talking about classism, but I hadn't seen the mainstream sort of narrative touch on this question of race. And we all know that just because mainstream news doesn't cover something, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Right? Just because we weren't hearing the you know, or reading headlines that talked about racism doesn't mean that there weren't activists working on it, doesn't mean that racism wasn't happening. And so it was important for me to use this news peg of the protests and use that to say, hey, you guys are talking about this, but you can also be talking about this, and let me show you how I can bring it together. Thankfully, Pulitzer agreed. They gave me a little bit of money, and then I went down there and was able to report. I just wanted to pull up this video really quickly because this kind of connects to the point I was making about influence. We often, you know, we think of Puerto Ricans, sometimes we call people Spanish, which is actually a mistake because Puerto Ricans aren't Spanish. Spanish people from Spain are Spanish. Puerto Ricans may speak Spanish, but they're a mix of cultural influences. And so here's an example. Let's see if I can actually get it to play. All right, and I'm gonna turn the volume up. All right, so you hear African drums and rhythms, and you see people with melanin, right? So this is not necessarily a white crowd or even just a mixed crowd. You see that there are Black people on the island, and you see many of the African influences coming through in the culture. All right, so that, I love that video. I've watched it many times, and I just, I'm entranced listening to the music and watching the dancing. But that is Puerto Rican Bomba, and it is a music and dance form that is unique to the island, but obviously has a lot of African influence. And so this is what we mean when we talk about our perceptions of what a Latino is, and specifically what a Puerto Rican is, right? And then the reality of that influence based on history and so many other factors. So the census trends were pointing to an underreported story, and we were seeing some reactions to that in other forms of media. This is a piece written by Dr. William Darity over at Duke, talking about the Latino flight to whiteness and how people self-classify and what that means. So I went to Puerto Rico, as I said. This was me at a Bomba class with some dancers, and really just immersed myself into listening and learning about how people saw themselves, and really went in with no judgment, not a particular agenda to tell people what to think, but I wanted to know whether those who I would see as Black, or others might say are Black, whether they saw themselves as Black, why or why not. So I had 1 week to connect, less than a week actually. And I met many different people. I met activists who were fighting racism and xenophobia. This is a Dominican activist, which again, see, there are many different types of Latinos, right? So this particular activist came from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico, and he was calling out many of the ways in which immigrants were discriminated against on the island. So in the same ways that some of us experience discrimination, we also can, discriminate against others. And so that was a really important story. I met writers and journalists who were changing narratives by covering things that their local media would not cover. And I met cultural ambassadors who were preserving and celebrating the African cultural influence. So this is one of my interviewees, Sasha. She's a journalist, a mother, and an activist. And she started a magazine dedicated to Afrolatinas. So you'll see that her hair is beautiful and natural. She's wearing it in an afro. And for many years, she was told that that was ugly, that it was not acceptable to do so. Excuse me. This is Junior. He is one of the Bomba musicians and drummers who teaches about this dance and music cultural expression. And so he was born in Loíza, which is a town that has a really high percentage of Puerto Ricans who are racially Black and who still preserve that African tradition. And so they actually call it the center of tradition, that town. I loved interviewing him because his perspective was really different. He actually did not call himself Black or Afro-Latino. He wanted to be called Puerto Rican. And that was because he said that, he's just as Puerto Rican as anyone else. We'll get into that a little bit later. This is Marcos. He's a lawyer. I mean, I was blown away because often when I look at, again, representations of Latinos, we don't see people that look like Marcos. He started his own law firm, and his daughter actually grew up to be a lawyer as well. So she's one of the attorneys at the firm, and they take on cases dealing a lot with discrimination, whether it's gender, race, anything. They fight for those who have been discriminated against. Excuse me. So these are some of the stories that came out of 1 week of reporting. And I like to share this because I want young journalists and aspiring journalists to know that, listen, you can go someplace and it's like an octopus with tentacles, right? There's so many different stories that you can cover just by tackling this one topic. And so for me, through identity, I wrote a piece that appeared in the New York Times about why some Black Puerto Ricans choose white on the census. I did a story about police violence against Dominicans, particularly in Puerto Rico. I did a story about Sasha's magazine dedicated to celebrating Afro-Latina beauty. I shared a little bit of my reporter's notebook in NPR. And of course, on the griot, I wrote a story about Marcos and his daughter. So this is the culmination of the work. I've done all of these stories for this project, highlighting what it means to be Afro-Latino in Puerto Rico, or Afro-Latinx. And I decided to take all of the footage and put it into one video, right? Because part of journalism is reaching people where they are. And I want to reach people who maybe won't read the New York Times, or who are not going to listen to NPR, but they will watch a video on YouTube, and make that information just as accessible for them and introduce them to the many different people I met and the issues that were raised. So let's take a look at the trailer for this documentary, which came from this reporting trip, and it's called Afro-Latinx Revolution, Puerto Rico.
¿Tú eres dominicano? Y yo, no. ¿Tú eres cubano? Y yo, no. Puertorriqueño, y me decían, me guste, porque ellos piensan que una persona puertorriqueña es clara de color, con pelo colorado, bajita, una mujer, y el varón es blanquito, con ojos claros. Esa es la percepción que tenían en aquellos tiempos de un puertorriqueño. Y yo le dije, no, hay una comunidad de negros en Puerto Rico bien importante.
What does it mean to be Black in Puerto Rico? And how are Afro-Latinx identity movements impacting the island today?
Los Afrolatinos, we are too Latin to be Black, or we are too Black to be Latinos.
Hay un mestizaje en Puerto Rico y hay gente que se identifica unos más negros que otros.
Somos descendientes de África, la mayoría de nosotros. Pero yo no puedo decir que yo soy africano, yo soy puertorriqueño.
En verdad que yo me identifico en todo. Yo soy negro, tengo el pelo bien rizo.
Pues donde dice que todos somos, que todos tenemos de negros y de africanos, ¿verdad? De españoles y de indígenas, que aquí no hay racismo porque eso es un problema del pasado que nunca ha habido. Eso no ha dejado que Puerto Rico se mire a sí mismo, se comprenda desde una situación política su relación racial.
Para hacer ruido se usa la plena. Para resistir con el cuerpo y con nuestra voz usamos la bomba.
The Griot explores race, culture, and justice in PR.
Cuando miramos todas esas manifestaciones, esas son manifestaciones negras.
To uncover an Afro-Latinx revolution.
All right, so that's the trailer. I'm so excited about it. I really wanted, again, a visual representation of the amazing people that I met and all of the conversations that I had, and I hope that it inspires even more reporting and more exploration of this question of identity and race and all of the ways in which it shows up in our lives. Let's see, I'm gonna go to this next slide here. So this was just a thought that I wanted to share for journalists as, just a guiding principle, to really remember that interviewees are people first. So even if you have an idea for a story or a project and you're like, yes, this needs to be told, like we have to get the story out there. At the end of the day, these are people's lives that they are opening up and sharing with you and putting on the record. And so there's a level of sensitivity, there's a level of humility in which you have to have in order to approach people in the right way and get them to open up. And to know that certain subjects like racial identity are really touchy and can be controversial and taboo. When I first got down there were people who were like, what racism? Like what problem? And I was like, oh my God, Pulitzer gave me money to go do a story that doesn't exist. Like, what am I gonna do? And was like a little worried that, had I just made this up in my head, right? But that goes into the next point, which is to believe in your instincts. I knew that that data was saying something, and I didn't need to make the story what I wanted to be. I just needed to go find the story. I needed to find people with different perspectives who could help illuminate why that census data was what it was and why I'd experienced certain things in my life. I knew that there was something there. So really finding that balance between the two it's an art and a little bit of a science, if you really think about the craft of journalism and interviewing. So check out my video on interviewing on Pulitzer. But that is part of our jobs, is to go and get that story and get as close to the truth as we can, no matter how messy or complicated it is. So that's the last part, is to stay flexible. Even if things aren't going the way you think they might go on a reporting trip or on a story, keep digging, keep pushing until you get the answers that you need to. And that's the next question, which, I think this would be great for teachers to ask their students, is what issues being overlooked in a big news story right now? So in the same way that everybody was talking about the protests in Puerto Rico last summer, there was this story that was being overlooked. And look now we're talking about race all the time. It's like like a veil was lifted, and the media finally realizes, I hate that term, the media, but all of a sudden there's this dedicated time and space to unpacking race issues, which we know are not new and that they've always been there. So you may be a little ahead of your time with your story, right? But do the work. It's still important, whether people acknowledge it or not in the moment. Last thing I want to say is just that this story changed my life. Not only did I learn so much from the people who I interviewed, and was reminded, I think a lot of times Puerto Rico is forgotten. We talk about it as this beautiful place for tourism, but it is part of the United States, and things aren't great. There's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of environmental there are a lot of environmental issues going on right now, natural disasters, and we need to care for and be invested in what is happening over there. And so just going over there really helped me reconnect in a really tangible way beyond the intellectual. Just seeing it for myself was important. And that is part of journalism, is bearing witness. And I also got to meet family members who I'd never met before. This is actually my great aunt. Not sure if you could see the resemblance. We look nothing alike, but that's my great aunt. And so being on this trip allowed me to reconnect with her and to meet her. So yeah, that is the power of journalism, to both, change our lives personally, but to change the lives of others by telling underreported stories.
Thank you so much, Natasha, both for sharing that incredible story and all of your personal passion for it. So let's send Natasha some appreciation in the chat box now as we turn to Q&A. Thank you so much. And we've had some wonderful questions coming in. A reminder, you can throw your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A. That may be the easiest way to go. But right now we have a question from Abigail about the causes of stereotypes. Abigail asks, what caused people to think that Puerto Ricans are just one race instead of a diversity of races?
That's a wonderful question. I think the media plays a huge role in that. Often, if you look at Spanish language media, a lot of the TV news anchors, they happen to be white Latinos. They have a particular look, whether it's long, straight hair or really light skin. And so that reaffirms this image of this is the standard, and anyone else is not the default, they are the other. We see that also in, TV shows and movies where if you see an Afro-Latino, they're often the maid, they're the cook, they're sort of a character that's in the background. And that mirrors things that we've seen here in the continental US, in terms of representation and diversity. So I think that's part of where the stereotypes come from. I also think that, there's just, we still haven't unpacked slavery. Like, we haven't really unpacked these histories. A lot of folks don't know that approximately 90%, like a large majority of slaves, Africans who were enslaved, came to the Caribbean and Latin America. It was actually a much smaller percentage that came here to the continental US. So we're talking about, a really abusive and violent and racist system of colonialism that's throughout Latin America. And just because slavery technically ended doesn't mean that that's not going to influence society today, right? It means it will influence it. So I think that sometimes we, particularly in Latino communities, we emphasize harmony and diversity. And look, we have all these different colors in our community, but to a detriment of addressing racial issues directly and sometimes denying it. So I think all those things play a role.
Thanks, Natasha, and also sending some appreciation to folks in the chat who are sharing their ideas and reflections on that question as well, including thoughts about how historical narratives play into this and what we're taught about American history. One person would like to know, what part of Puerto Rico did you travel to? And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how you chose the places that you went to for your story.
Another great question. So, when you have 1 week and a certain budget to get something done, it does force you to focus. And so it's very important to note that I did not go to all of Puerto Rico, right? I didn't visit, all parts of the island. I went to Loíza, which is a coastal town that I knew based on census records had a really high population of Afro-Latinos or Afro-Puerto Ricans. But that doesn't mean that all Afro-Puerto Ricans live in Loíza. There are plenty who live in other parts of the island and who have experiences that matter. So I also went to Carolina, which is like it's an area that's near San Juan. It's not too far of a drive, but between San Juan, Carolina, and Loíza, that's where I focused the reporting. But yeah, if I were to do it again, or be able to go back for like a part 2 or something like that, I would definitely want to visit some other places just to kind of show both the presence and the cultural influence of Afro-Puerto Ricans.
Amazing, thank you. One person has a question about how you got started in journalism. They want to know where you went to college and how you began your career, and maybe a little bit about what inspired you to do this as well.
Yeah, it's funny because I see a question asking, this is from Rowney Gregory, whether I went to Nottingham High School, and I did. I went to Nottingham High School in Syracuse, New York. That's where I was born and raised. So good to see you. So yeah, when I was at Nottingham, I was in high school. I was the co-editor of the school newspaper. And what happened was when I went to college, I went to Harvard, and Harvard did not have journalism as a major. So I went in thinking, oh, I'm going to be a journalist. They didn't have it. It was a liberal arts curriculum. And so I just ended up on a different path. I got recruited by an investment firm and went and worked in the kind of business investment world for a year. And then decided to go into education. I did a program called Teach for America, and taught in Washington, D.C., and really loved that. But there was always something in my heart that was like, you should go back to that dream. You never pursued that dream that you really wanted to do. And so when I was 27, so yeah, I was like 5 years out of college, I said, you know what, I'm going to go for my dream. And I applied to graduate school at Northwestern. I got into the program and I got a master's in broadcast journalism. So I like to share that because, life is not necessarily a straight line. And just because maybe you didn't do something right out of school or you didn't study something, it doesn't mean that you still can't live out that dream that you may have. And all those other things I did, I think prepared me for journalism. Teaching made me a much better journalist. Just all of those experiences. I worked in education policy, all of those things informed it. So yeah, that's how I got to where I'm at today.
Amazing. There's some questions in the chat about going into a little bit of the backstory for this reporting project. It's such a diverse reporting project. You have stories about celebrating identity and progress, and also a lot of stories about diving into some of the problems that people are resisting. EJ wants to know why people were trying to overthrow the government and what the issue with the governor in Puerto Rico was.
Yeah, so, really, as I kind of alluded to before, this is a combination of a bunch of issues. So it's almost like a pot of water that just finally boiled over. You had this issue of Puerto Rico being in debt and the United States government demanding that Puerto Rico pay back all of this debt that the island couldn't afford to pay. And through that process, there were very rich people, a lot of business people who came to the island. They bought up land, they pushed residents out of certain areas so they could build hotels and, do their business on the island. And a lot of people were left impoverished, but it doesn't even start there. It goes even further back to this idea that the US, took Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is in a colonial relationship with the United States. And there are some Puerto Ricans who would like to be independent. They don't want to be a part of, this US experiment or the government. They believe that they can, run the island independently. So that battle and that tension has always existed. And I think you have that in addition to the environmental disasters of the island, being hit with hurricanes. And at one point there were earthquakes, and seeing that people died, and the response was just not there. It took years to really get the money to the island that should have gone to the island, when those crises first happened. So people were really fed up, and it's like a precursor to what happened this summer. I mean, if you in the continental US, you think about, we're home, there's COVID, people have lost their jobs, and then you have all of this, these racism, incidents of racism and death, and people took to the streets. They just had enough. So what happened in Puerto Rico in terms of people being fed up, I think you're seeing it. You're seeing it here as well.
That's really helpful. We have another person asking, do you see similar imbalances in the criminal justice system in Puerto Rico and in the continental US, particularly with regard to policing and incarceration, but also other issues of racial injustice?
Right. So this one was a tricky question to answer. And because I went to the island with that being one of my top questions, the problem is because the island doesn't really track race, you don't necessarily see where the disparities are in a numbers sense. I had to go to local activist organizations. One is Kilometro Cero, and they were tracking each person that Puerto Rican police killed. So they were doing that independent tracking. But when you went onto the Puerto Rican Police Department website, for example, they didn't have numbers of the murders in relation to race, or the killings in relation to race. And so that's part of the problem, right? If you are in a society where people say racism is not a problem, they are not forced to actually count or create policy or, address these issues in regards to race. And I think that is why the census story was so important, because the census story was saying how we see ourselves and how we track ourselves makes a population visible or invisible. So if you have all these Afro-Puerto Ricans who are Black, who could be counted as Black, who are not saying that they're Black, you're not going to see those disparities actually show up in your research or on paper. Another really good example that I found in reporting was that they did a study where they asked people to put their skin color. So instead of saying, are you white, are you Black? Because a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of Latinos in general don't like the white, Black box. They asked them to put their skin color shade on a scale of 1 to 6, right? 1 being the lightest, 6 being the darkest. And when they looked at the data that way, they found that the darker skin Latinos had worse health outcomes, right? So that is an example of data showing you racial disparity. Even when people don't think that there's racism, quote unquote, the data is showing you racial disparity. So that's why it's a long-winded way of saying that part of the problem with tracking the police brutality question in regards to race is that they don't count, they don't track. Now, what they have done, the Department of Justice had the Puerto Rican Police Department under a federal order to like revamp and reform. And so you have that going on, you know, officially, but again, that's about larger abuses against citizens. So it's a question that basically needs to be explored more. That's my answer.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
We have a couple people asking questions about the wider Latinx and Afro-Latinx communities beyond Puerto Rican borders. One person is personally reflecting, why do you think I, as a Mexican American, have to put white as my race on the census? And another person, Howard, asks, have you had an opportunity to explore Afro-Latinos in Cuba, Panama, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia? So have you done work on other Afro-Latinx communities, and what have those stories looked like?
Yeah, so in a formal way, I can't say that I have. I've certainly interviewed just amazing Afro-Latino, Latina, and Afro-Latinx leaders. So the first person who comes to mind is like Dash Harris. She's Panamanian, and we've profiled her work. She did a documentary, a great documentary called Negro, and she also runs Afro-Latino Travel. So she is kind of decolonizing the travel space, which often tends to be not diverse, or, you know, you go to these countries and you see the country through the lens of a white person who maybe necessarily is not from that country, but they created the travel guide. They create these experiences. So she is doing that work. So we've profiled her, I've interviewed her. I'm thinking also Janelle Martinez from Ain't I Latina. She's Garifuna from Honduras. And so that's another example of Afro-Latinos in other countries and cultures. And really just like lightly in the New York Times story mentioned that the same way that there are activists in Puerto Rico, shout out to Colectivo Ile, they are the women that I profiled in the New York Times story. The same way that those activists are encouraging Puerto Ricans who are Black to check Black on the census, that's happening in Mexico, that's happening in Chile. So these movements are kind of like taking off. And that's part of why I called this project a revolution, because I think that the internet has sparked like a new generation's revolution. It's not to say that this revolution didn't exist before. There's always been Afro-Latinos and there's always been activism around race, but there's like a new generation and a new iteration of it that I wanted to really document. For the person who asked the question about being white, or being forced to check white, I think I understand what your question is, or I hope I do. I think that one of the big takeaways from this project is that people deserve to have a language and options that reflect who they are in these on census materials, on these sort of research projects that are supposed to document our lived experiences. And I know for me, it was always frustrating getting a race section on a form, and it would say Black, not Hispanic. And then it would say like Hispanic. And I'm like, well, I can't choose one of the, because I'm both. So, you know, you're telling me that I have to pick this one. I can't deny my Blackness. I am Black, like this is who I am. But in order to talk about the Hispanic, quote unquote, or the Latinx side, I would have to say that I'm not Black. You know, I think that's the problem, is not giving space for that intersectionality and that nuance. And so, you know, there are white Mexicans, there are Black Mexicans. Some people don't know that. There are people who are mestizo, right? And they're like a mix of many things. And I think that we need to make space for people being able to represent all of those various identities, and do so in a language that honors the local understanding of what race and ethnicity is. And they're different things.
Thank you so much. There's so many wonderful questions in here, and I wish that we could get to them all. One question from Wendy touches on an issue that you've brought up several times about who is telling these stories and whose voices are being elevated in them. Wendy asks, why aren't mainstream TV news platforms employing or making visible Latinx journalists? And what will it take for these mainstream platforms to include Latinx journalists as anchors and panelists on the issues other than single story narratives of the vote in Miami or immigration, things like that? And maybe if you can talk at all about what path forward you see in the news industry.
I ask this question all the time. It's part of why I'm doing this project, because I'm just like, you know, how many years are we going to say Afro-Latinos exist? We want to move past that. Like, we want everybody to understand that we exist. Now let's get to talking about the actual issues, right? What are our lived experiences? Where is there racial injustice, and how does that manifest? So yeah, I think this is really a project of like visibility as a first step, but we really have to like push past that. So visibility in addition to the political organizing and pressure that you do. And so you know, I think it's calling out the lack of diversity. I'm certainly seeing it in the wake of this new wave of Black Lives Matter, and people saying, yeah, it's not going to cut it to have, you know, all white boardrooms or all white newscasts. And I think we need to see that rising, people to rise up in that way in Latin American communities. And I see, you know, there's like, you always have your examples of, why is her name escaping me now? Is she at Telemundo or Univision? Ilia Calderon, right? Brilliant, beautiful, but it's like not enough for Ilia to be, oh, we've got one, you know, Afro-Colombian anchor and so we're good. It's like she should be, you know, one of many, right? She's a pioneer. So we have to press these organizations and corporations for representation. And yeah, I think it starts with really keeping these stories alive, and reporting on the disparities. So I want to see more reporting around some of those health disparities that I was talking about, some of the housing issues, you know, the kind of like public housing that is in Puerto Rico specifically is like really terrible down there, and the ways that it tends to be the darker skinned Puerto Ricans who are put in these poor areas. So yeah, I'm just one that thinks that like reporting is the first step, you know, raising awareness, and then people will have to go in and like create accountability.
As you continue this incredible reporting project that is ongoing for you, we have at least 6 people asking, when is this documentary coming out? How can we find it? So can you tell us about that? And also anything else that you want to mention that you have on the horizon that people should be looking out for?
Okay, yeah, no, I'm only laughing because I've been trying to get this documentary done for like the past 6 months. But I do have a full-time job in addition to, I'm producing another documentary about solitary confinement. So, and then we have all this breaking news. So it's been insane. It's been really hard to get the project done because I want to represent like what's happening in the moment. And so all the protests that happen, I had to go back and say, hey, we have to include this in the documentary. And there were a couple people that I wanted to interview, so I was able to get them. But it's supposed to be coming out within the next 2 weeks. So during Latinx Heritage Month, there's the Liberación Film Festival that's taking place next week. It's Afro-Latino Festival in New York City. For those of you who are not familiar, definitely look them up online. And we will be screening it there. So follow me on Twitter or Instagram, Natasha S. Alford. And you can follow the GRIO, G-R-I-O, and you'll be the first to know.
Amazing. Thank you again so much for being with us. We're about out of time, and we did have other questions that we didn't get to today. So thank you so much to everybody for your wonderful reflections and questions in the chat and in our Q&A here. But we're really grateful to you for being here, and thank you for sharing how to follow you. And we'll also share a little bit more of your reporting and how to find out a little bit more about Natasha's work in our follow-up email to this webinar for all registrants. So before we close out together, is there anything that you want to leave us with today, Natasha?
Oh, I was literally just typing. I didn't know if I could say goodbye. I was like, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Amazing audience. I saw all of your comments. You had excellent questions. And this is what I'm hoping, that it inspires a new generation, current generation of journalists to go out and ask these other questions, because it's not the work of one person, it's the work of an entire community for us to continue to elevate this. So yeah, go get those stories and trust your instincts and believe and fight till you get to the truth. Yeah, that's our jobs as journalists, and we're so needed right now in this time.
Thank you, and I hope everyone will take your advice. Thank you, Natasha. We're going to turn for just one moment as we close out in our final 3 minutes here to a couple of upcoming opportunities and resources that you can refer back to. We'll send you more of these, and we'll also send you a recording of this webinar after we close out. But definitely, Natasha mentioned that she made a video about how to do interviews that lead to underreported stories like the ones that she told from Puerto Rico on the Pulitzer Center website. So check out that video. It has incredible tips for journalists of any age. And you can also explore a little bit more of her story through that video as well. We also have some more webinars coming up soon. Join us on October 14th or October 20th for a webinar to prepare for our annual letter writing contest. If you were inspired by Natasha's story today, you can use her stories to think about what issues are there in the world and in your own community that you want to address, and write a letter to your local representatives and for the Pulitzer Center Writing Contest, arguing for solutions that you want to see to the problems in the world that are most pressing to you. And finally, we'll have another webinar coming up on the 29th for you to meet Brittany Gibson, an amazing fellow at The Prospect, who will be talking about the fight against voter suppression in the US elections in 2020. She's been doing a lot of amazing reporting on a very difficult issue that's on a lot of our minds, and we'll have some incredible information for us that day, including some actionable steps for all of us to keep in mind. So I want to say thank you once again to everybody for being here. It's been wonderful to get to spend this time with you, Natasha, and with all of you thinking about underreported stories, and getting to hear some of your reflections. So take a minute to fill out that survey when we close out, and please stay in touch following Natasha, but also feel free to reach out to the Pulitzer Center anytime, and we can talk about how to collaborate more on bringing journalists into your classroom, or how to produce journalism yourselves. So thank you so much for being with us. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.